Our Old Testament reading comes from the prophet Isaiah. We'll be reading Isaiah chapter 55. Isaiah 55, beginning in verse 1. Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. Behold, you shall call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you, because of the Lord your God and of the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy, and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall make a name for the Lord, an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. You know, when it comes to our speech, our communication, it's not uncommon for us to use manipulative tactics to try to manipulate others. Now, manipulate is one of those funny words in our language where we can use it in a positive sense, right? That something can be manipulated or worked on with skill. So an artist, for instance, might take a block of marble and manipulate it, we would say, and turn it into a beautiful statue. But it's also negative, and we usually use it in a negative sense, and that's how I'm going to be using it. Right? It's in some way using underhanded or deceptive means to influence or change someone or some circumstance. And when we do this, we might not always think that we're being manipulative. But very often we use our words in such a way as to try to force the reaction that we want out of someone. Now here too, there's kind of a careful line, because there's a good thing that we call persuasion, right? Learning how to most clearly articulate the truth and speak of it in such a way that somebody wants to respond the way that they should. But that's not manipulation. There are limits to what we can do. Obvious examples of manipulation in our words is deceit, so lying, fabricating something. Another would be where you're just very selective in what you're willing to openly say. So you only ever share what you think others would want to hear or would receive in some way that you want them to, even if it means concealing something that you know you're supposed to say or share or speak. Maybe the most common way we do this today is through emotion, the way we emote in our language, where we use our emotion in some way to try to get the other person in a conversation to respond the way that we want them to. So maybe, for instance, you're found out in something that you've done that's wrong, and so you cry, not because you're just caught and you feel grief, but also because you think, well, maybe if I cry, the other person will be more sympathetic in how they act toward me, right? They're not going to do what I deserve. They're going to change how they act because it will put me in the position of a victim. Or otherwise, we use different kinds of what we would call sophistry. That sophistry is using words without regard to their meaning, but just to get the kind of reaction that you want, right? So without regard for the truth, you just want certain effects. You say what you want to say without regard to that which is true and good and beautiful. Now, why do I say all this? You're like, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with Isaiah 55. Right? Where is that here? Well, I say it because when you read and see how God speaks and what He's like and how He communicates, you realize that He is not one that manipulates. He never does. The way that God communicates is never manipulative. He does not lie, and He always says what needs to be said. And that's important because it's one of the foundations of why we can trust the kinds of things that He promises us. You can come to Him and know you will find exactly what He says, that you'll receive exactly what He says He will give, because He does not lie. He does not use underhanded ways. The Lord doesn't have to manipulate because His truth is the truth. Right? When we manipulate, a lot of times it's because we want our truth, what we'd like to be true, even though it's not true, to be the truth. Right? We want how we feel or what we want to be what is true. God doesn't have to do that because He is Himself the truth. So what He speaks is true. He speaks everything that is meant to be according to His word. And everything that He speaks happens. This is a major difference between our speech and His, and it's one of the reasons we practice manipulation. Because we want to be in the position of God. We want to be able to change things and work things in the way that we would like them to be. When the word of the Lord goes forth, it accomplishes everything that He wants. It succeeds in all of His purposes. And our words are not that way. And so we try to take a power that is not ours. And we try to take it through a clever or unfair or underhanded means. But when we see how God speaks, what His word is like, what should we do? How should we respond? Well, instead of practicing manipulation, right, trying to take what is not ours, what we should do is simply align our words with His words. He has spoken clearly, openly, and directly. And He hasn't done so in such a way as to force something on you that isn't true or doesn't fit. He doesn't have to do that. His word is all-powerful. And as we read here, it will not return to Him empty. Our New Testament reading is from John 18. We'll be picking up where we left off last week in verse 12 and reading through verse 27. This is John 18, beginning in verse 12, if you want to follow along with me. Hear the word of the Lord. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl, who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire, because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. This is God's holy and inspired word for us this morning. Now, if you listened carefully as we read through that text just now, you would have heard a contrast. John presents a striking contrast, as he so often does in this gospel. It's a contrast between Jesus and the world, of truth and manipulation. And any time, especially in John, that this kind of contrast is used, it holds out a question for you. Which way will you go? Right? What road will you take? Will you go the way of the world? The way of manipulation, deception, projection? Or will you follow the way of Christ? Right? The way of the open statement of the truth. I say it's a contrast between Jesus and the world, but as it's put in the story, in the narrative, it's a contrast between Jesus and Peter. Peter denies Jesus. He denies the truth. He tries to save himself by distancing himself from the truth. All the while, Jesus continues to do what he has always done, what he always does, which is speak the truth. To align yourself with Jesus is to align yourself with the truth, wholly, completely, and without reservation. Now, John sets up this scene as Jesus has been arrested. He's then bound, and he's brought before Annas, a high official amongst the Jews. He likely a previous high priest, and so he's even going to be spoken of as the high priest at one point, even though Caiaphas is the high priest. And from Annas, he'll be taken to Caiaphas. And he mentioned specifically that Caiaphas is the one who had spoken earlier about the expediency of having one man killed, referring to Jesus, in order to save the rest of the people. And when we read that earlier in John, if you remember when Caiaphas says that, what he likely means by it is we should kill Jesus, and that way we would be able to keep our position, and nobody else would die if the Romans come in, they try to stamp out a rebellion that's following Jesus. But as the high priest, we're told that he was not just saying that of his own volition completely, but he was prophesying. That as the high priest, he prophesied, and though he did not have ears to hear it himself, even though he was the one speaking it, what it meant was that Jesus, in fact, would be killed. He would die for the sake of the people. It just wouldn't be in the way that Caiaphas thought. It would be in a much greater way. And with that setup, John then turns the focus to the disciples, specifically two disciples, to Peter and another disciple who's just called the other disciple, who's almost definitely John, the author of the gospel. Now, before reading that beginning portion again, I just want to show you the structure so that as we read this, because we'll be jumping around a little bit, you see how it is that John has presented this story. You heard it as we read that he begins in verse 15 to 18 speaking about Peter and this other disciple. And then he comes back around to that again at the end in verse 25 to 27. And then it's in between this story that you have sandwiched the testimony of Jesus. And so what Jesus says, what he speaks, as he's asked specifically to speak of his disciples, is sandwiched between Peter being asked multiple times if he is a disciple, for him to testify about being a disciple. So with that, John says this, again in verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Jesus stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The soldiers take Jesus to be tried, and Peter and this other disciple, again, I believe it to be John, follow after him. I say it's John. There's a lot of people today that think maybe it wasn't John, but if you follow from this point on through the rest of the Gospel of John, there are two disciples that are constantly, put in stories together at Jesus' death, at his resurrection, after his resurrection. And we know that that other disciple is said at the very end of John to be the one who's writing this gospel. And so that's why I say this is almost definitely John himself, as he's constantly compared to Peter in these last chapters especially. Now, as they follow Jesus to where he's going to be tried, or at least the beginning of the trial as he speaks to Annas and then he'll speak to Caiaphas, they get split up for a moment, it seems like. I imagine it kind of like, you've probably seen this in a movie where there's somebody really famous, there's somebody who's not at all, and they go to a party or a club, and the one guy walks in and the other guy's kind of kept out by the bouncers. He's kept out of the building. And then the famous person has to come back and be like, wait, no, he's with me. It's kind of what's happening here. John is known to the high priest, and so he goes right in. He follows Jesus right in, but Peter is kept out. It's interesting that it says that John is known to the high priest, that he's close enough that they also likely know, as the servant girl is going to say in a moment, that he is one of Jesus' disciples. But he's known so well that he's just allowed to go right in. He's not kept out at all. And here Peter waits outside, maybe because he wasn't known at all, but also remember what just happened to Peter. or rather what Peter just did in the garden before this. The officials and servants of the high priest come with this band of soldiers to the garden, and Peter tried to kill one of them. He cut off Malchus's ear. And so it's also likely that Peter's not going to try to push anything, right? He's trying to keep a low profile. He's trying not to get noticed. So if he's not allowed in right away, he's not going to try to force his way in and make a scene. But John evidently notices that Peter was missing, and we're told that he goes back out to bring him in. He talks to this servant girl at the door, tells her to let Peter in, and as she does, she asks him a question. She asks him to testify to his discipleship. Are you not one of this man's disciples too? Inferring that she knows John is one of his disciples. But Peter says no. He's trying to keep a low profile. He doesn't want people to know he was in the garden. Then they might find out he was the one who had attacked Malchus. You have to wonder what John was thinking, although I think it's very possible that he wasn't even there when Peter says no, that he just tells the servant girl, let him in, and then he bolts back because he wants to be with Christ. He wants to be where Christ is. Evidently, as Peter comes inside, there's a fire that's been started. And who's there around the fire? It's the servants of the chief priests and the officers of the chief priests. Likely, many of whom had just been in the garden. These are people that could find out pretty easily what it is that Peter has done. So Peter goes by the fire, but he's probably keeping back a bit too. Think about maybe a time you've been in a position where you go to some kind of a get-together, birthday party, there's a bonfire, but you came with a friend, you don't know anybody there, right? You're standing around, it's kind of strange, you're trying not to really get into too much conversation with others. But then add to that what Peter would be feeling in this moment, which would be fear. He's fearful that he's going to be found out, that they're going to find out who he is. He's just committed a serious crime against somebody that everybody around him knows. What would happen if they find out? Maybe he'd be arrested. Maybe they would take justice into their own hands. They would try to harm him. Peter's scared of what they might do. And that's when they're going to start to ask him, right? Aren't you that guy? Aren't you one of them? And what does Peter do? He lies. Right? And haven't you been in that position too? You're asked something that you're afraid of the consequences of telling the truth. Right? If I tell the truth, it will not go well for me, and so you lie, or you twist the truth in some way to save yourself. And that's what we think we're doing, right? When we try to twist the truth, when we try to manipulate others, what are we doing? We're trying to save ourselves in some form. You lie and try to change things through using what is false. You try to manipulate the situation by changing your words according to what you think will have the outcome that you want, rather than, in these moments, speaking openly what you know to be right. That's what happens to Peter here. All right, we're going to jump over the portion about Christ as he's questioned, and look how Peter's portion resolves. Verse 25, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. He's standing around the fire, And more people begin to ask him if he is a disciple of Jesus. And he denies it. And it's easy when you read these stories to look down on Peter, to think that you're in some way better off than him, right? How could he do this? He knew Jesus. How could he do this to Jesus? But John makes it pretty clear why he might feel the pressure, especially with the third question that comes to him. Because he's asked by somebody who's a relative of the man who he just tried to kill. And the man doesn't just say, "Are you one of his disciples?" He says, "Didn't I see you in the garden?" So they're getting really close, right? They're close to figuring out who he is. And any of us put into that situation would likely do the same. Maybe we even have in some way at some point. Now we're told this third time that Peter denies that he's a disciple of the Lord, that this is when the rooster crows. And it's nothing more is said here about that, but if you remember, this is what Jesus said would happen. He said, "Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." Jesus knew this was going to happen. Peter said, "There's no way, right? I would never do that." But Jesus knew from the beginning that this would happen. You have to imagine how devastating this would be for Peter. Right? In that moment, realizing that you are actually the kind of man that would do that. Right? In the moment, feeling like I have good reasons to lie. Right? Very plausible reasons for why I should neglect to tell the truth, why I should deny Christ before these people. And then, in a second, hearing that sound, remembering Jesus' words, all that it would take is that little reminder. And no doubt he was absolutely crushed. The weight of the realization that you are, in fact, like the world, that you are, in fact, a man of unclean lips. And this is our nature, right? To lie, to twist the truth, to speak falsehood in order to change the outcome of a situation, in order that we wouldn't have to face certain consequences or avoid some kind of suffering. All right? We lie for some kind of salvation. We might not call it that or think about it in that way, but that's what it is, right? I want what is good for me, and the truth will not get me there. Right? I want a good outcome, and the truth can't accomplish that. So I need something else. I need to lie. That's the way of the world. That's what's put on display here. That is the way of lying, of manipulation. But what about the way of Christ? Putting this as a text that's sandwiched between Peter's denial, where Jesus is given the opportunity to testify himself, likely means that this is going on simultaneously. So while Peter is denying Jesus 3 times, Jesus is also asked, right, staring down the barrel of a gun, knowing that he is about to suffer far more than Peter would have if he told the truth. What does Jesus do when he's asked about his disciples? Verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." Now just stop for a second. We just saw what Peter said when he was asked about Jesus. And here Jesus says, ask those, right? Ask those who heard me. Verse 22, when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Jesus is facing his own death. He knows what they're going to do to him, but he doesn't shift what he says to try to keep that from happening. He says, "I've spoken openly. Everybody has heard what I've said. I've not said anything in secret." Now, he doesn't mean that he hasn't said some things privately, right? There are some things that he said to the disciples that he didn't say to everyone. But what he's saying is, everything that I've said publicly and privately is consistent, right? It's not as though I'm saying something totally different in private, because outwardly I'm just telling everybody some kind of lie, or I'm fabricating the truth. To the whole world, he has openly spoken the truth from the beginning of his ministry. And where we might lie or change our stories to try to manipulate our circumstances, he speaks openly and clearly and truthfully. And it's through speaking that truth that he is going to accomplish his will. It's interesting to see the high priest and others questioning Jesus as if he was doing the very thing that they've been doing the whole time. We've seen this over and over in John, that they are the ones who are scheming and plotting secretly in a way that they would never say outwardly. Right? They're the ones that come to Jesus and ask him things, trying to trick him, instead of just asking him directly the things they want to ask. And so here they project their own sin onto him, as if he must be like them. They're the ones that practice secretive and underhanded ways. They lie and try to manipulate others. And now they bring Jesus before them to question him as if he's like that. But he's totally different. Jesus is completely different from the world. He says you could call anyone to come and tell what I've been saying the whole time. It's all been public, it's all been open, it's all been clear. He didn't hide anything. Even today, there are times that you might think, I know what Jesus says in his word, I know what he's promised, but there's got to be some kind of a catch. Right? There must be some way that he's tricking me in this, but it's not true. Right? That's not like him. That is like us. That is like the world. It's not like him. We're told that he's struck by one of the officials for how he speaks to the high priest. There's an interesting story about Paul in Acts 23, where Paul's going through a very similar situation. And he calls the high priest a whitewashed wall or something like that. And he's struck for saying this. And they say, do you talk to the high priest this way? And he says, basically, I'm sorry, I didn't realize who I was talking to. Here, that's the expected reaction, right? You can't talk to the high priest this way. And Jesus more or less says, yes, I can. I can speak to him how I want. He doesn't owe allegiance to any earthly power. Remember, the high priest is his high priest. The high priest is supposed to be doing the Lord's will, and here the Lord stands before him, and when the Lord speaks, he's struck for it, for speaking the truth. Jesus more or less says to him, show me where I'm wrong. Right? Bear witness. Everybody's heard what I said, so bring them to bear witness. Once again, we see that Jesus is not cowed into saying something that isn't true. He always speaks the truth, even when the world is trying to force him, trying to twist his arm into speaking in some other way. He doesn't do it. And that's the contrast that John lays before us. The way of the world and the way of Christ. When you are asked like Peter, are you one of his disciples? Although it'll almost definitely not come in that form, right? People won't ever say that. But they might say something like, you don't actually believe that stuff, do you? Right? I know you go to church. You don't actually believe those things though, right? Right? When you're asked that way, right? When you stand before the world and you are questioned about your allegiance to Christ in some way, how will you respond? Right? Every time you're asked things like that, every time you're questioned in that way, you have these choices before you. Right? The way of the world. You twist the truth. You try to protect yourself through manipulation. Right? Maybe you don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to lose a client or a job. And so you just play it off in some way. Right? Well, I don't know. I don't know about all that. But the way of Christ is the way of truth. It's speaking the truth clearly and openly. That doesn't mean that you say everything all the time to every person. Right? There's still a wisdom component. Nobody wants to hear you just say everything you think all the time. Right? That's not what this is saying. Jesus doesn't do that here. That's not what the Lord wants. But will you speak the truth of Christ? Will you testify to him like he's willing to do? Will you stand for him in the way that he stood for you? The way of Christ is not to manipulate others with your words, not to change what you would otherwise say so as not to offend or feel awkward, or any of the many reasons we say, well, this is why I didn't say what I know that I should have. The way of Christ is the open statement of the truth. The way of Christ is to be willing to testify to him and to testify to the truth whenever necessary. Jesus, who is the truth, speaks the truth, and we want to be like him. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we bow ourselves before you and we pray that you would make us a people like you, that you would sanctify us by your Spirit through washing us in your word, and that we would continue to follow you, that in all that we say and all that we speak of you, we would be echoing back or responding to the truth that you have spoken. Lord, help us, we pray. Take these words, your word of truth, plant it deep in our hearts, water it by your Spirit, that it might grow and produce much fruit in our lives. To your glory we pray. Amen.